Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
And I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
All right. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us again on another Facebook Live. We're with Project Cold Case. We've been off for a couple of weeks with the holidays, Christmas and New Year's falling on Tuesdays. We obviously didn't have a Facebook Live show, but we've been working on them behind the scenes. Patty and I had the opportunity to escort a family to court recently, and that's something when we're dealing with cold cases that we don't get to do enough of. It's something that I have a lot of experience with a previous advocacy job, spending a lot of time in court. But when you're handling all cold cases all the time, we don't get to trial as often as we would like. Unfortunately, we hope that starts to change. That's one of our core goals is helping resolve cold cases. So a little background on the case we're going to talk about today, and Patty and I are going to tell stories about being in court for this trial and for the penalty phase. This was actually a death penalty case. So first off, this case was not actually submitted to our website because Project Cold Case was founded in 2015. And this arrest happened in 2013. So this arrest had happened before we were actually an organization. But we had been in constant contact with the state attorney's office about referring the family to us and us to the family so that we could offer some support during trial. So that being said, this is the case of Tammy Welch. She was 10 years old.
10 years old.
This is a picture of her from school. 10-year-old Tammy Welch lived in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1984. Her dad was in the Navy and was stationed at a Navy base here in Jacksonville.
Right.
They were living in an apartment complex, temporary housing in an apartment complex while waiting for base housing to come available. Tammy's dad was out to sea serving our country. The rest of his family, his wife, his daughter Tammy, and his son and another daughter, Michael and Jennifer, were moving that day from the apartment to the base housing they had been waiting on. It was the first day of school, August 27th, 1984. And moving day.
The kids got to stay home from school that day.
The kids stayed home. The movers were helping load things up. Tammy and her sister Jennifer were outside playing.
Right.
They got into a little spat, things that siblings often do, especially at that age.
Yes.
And Jennifer went upstairs, left Tammy outside, and something that probably happened, often and happens still often with kids, siblings particularly. Within 30 minutes, Tammy and Jennifer's mom tells Jennifer, go get your sister. I need her back in the house. Time to leave. Jennifer goes out to find her sister where they were playing. She's not there. She looks a few other places, can't find her. Comes back around the corner and finds her sister not breathing, obviously injured. Runs in and tells her mom. Her mom comes out and finds Tammy dead. Yeah. She had been raped, strangled, and murdered and dumped basically feet from her apartment. This was again August 27th, 1984. The arrest doesn't happen until 2013, and then trial just ended last month and the very end of 2018. So we're going to go through a little bit of the timeline and a little bit of the just facts, and then mostly our interaction with the family, the things that we learned. Obviously we've already stated this case is that of a 10-year-old girl raped and murdered. So it's obviously was a very graphic trial.
It was. It was very emotional. It's
hard to talk about. It's hard to listen to some of the things. We're going to try to keep it as with as little graphic detail as possible. But also with that being said, I want people to understand that this was a real life scenario. A little girl raped and murdered, and her family left in the wake. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that family went through over almost 30 years, to get an arrest made, right. And then almost 34 plus years before they actually got a conviction. So, just to kind of, to start out, we were actually able to find some old archive footage from the news stations here. So we're going to show you a little bit of that. Now remember, this is 1984, so the quality is not great, and it's a little bit bouncy and jumpy. But take a look at this. This is from the day it happened in 1984.
The scene at Yorktown Apartments was so simple, yet so bizarre. Only minutes before, neighbors had seen Tammy Jean Welch playing in the courtyard with her 12-year-old brother and younger sister. The next thing anyone knew, she lay dead, only 20 feet from her back door.
Somebody came and knocked on my door. That's the only reason why I heard something, and I came running because I seen everybody else running.
She was out here playing the pool with us yesterday evening, and kids are usually out here playing, but I seen the school started today. This is terrible. This is terrible.
Tammy's mother had been inside when it happened and had to be consoled by neighbors. The father was deployed on board a Navy ship.
All right, so that was taken from a local news channel, Channel 4 News here in Jacksonville in 1984. We'll show you here too. This was a newspaper clipping from around that time as well. It gives a little bit of the information. It gets some facts, what we found out later, a little bit wrong. So it's not that important, but I wanted to bring this up because we're going to talk about this more later, but this was a death penalty case. It was the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl. The defendant did not get the death penalty.
No.
And we talked about this leading up to it. I don't want to get too far into it now because I want to talk about it later, but this case 34 years later didn't feel like a death penalty case. And I think part of that was because the age of information and media that we deal with now, if a 10-year-old girl had been raped and murdered 2 years ago, mm-hmm. the community outrage, the public knowledge and information of the case would have been a lot different.
It would have been.
And I think it certainly rose to the level to be to seek the death penalty in the state of Florida. But anyway, we'll talk some more about that later. But I just wanted to point out, those were a couple of the media clips from back then. Just not a lot of information, not a lot of a front page story, or quite honestly, not a lot of outrage that we see nowadays when something happens to a child. So I just think that was an interesting point of note. When the arrest happens, we're not an organization. As we become aware that this is going on in the city where we are in Jacksonville, Florida, we start reaching out to the state attorney's office. We end up making contact with the family and asking their permission and receiving their permission to meet them the day of the trial starts in December or November. That was in November was the trial. Towards the end of November. And so that's your first meeting. And Patty, tell me a little bit. I wasn't there the first day of the trial. You were there. You met the family for the first time. You know, what was going through your head? You haven't gone to very many trials. You don't have a lot of
I don't have a lot of experience.
Trial experience. We haven't had that many cold cases go to trial locally that we've been a part of. So this was, I'm sure, a unique perspective from you on walking into that courthouse. Not that you hadn't been there before, but having to meet the families for the first time. They had to travel in from out of town. That was part of the reason why we didn't have an opportunity to meet them.
Right, they live
prior.
out of state.
They live out of state. The victim's dad and sister drove down for the trial specifically. Right. We're staying locally in a hotel. So you meet them. What are your thoughts? What was your experience?
Well, also it was a death penalty case, and that was completely new to me. But when I met the family, I met Mr. Welch, and I met Jennifer, and they were father and daughter, and they were this just sweet people. But I felt so sorry for them as far as going into the courtroom, and after all these years facing this person, and they've been trying to get him off because he wasn't mentally capable of a trial.
Yeah.
They were trying to, that's why it took, one of the reasons why it took so long, from 5 years of delays, legal delays. And I felt so sorry for them because of those delays. I mean, it's one thing they had to wait 34 years to get justice for their loved one, but those 5 years, they knew that the person had been arrested, and they had to wait and see if he was competent to stand trial. And they were very strong.
Yeah.
They were very strong people, and they went in and held their heads high, and the defendant turned around and looked at the family occasionally, and they have to sit there with no emotion. Yeah,
that's one of the toughest things. So we did a lot of research on this case, learned a lot from sitting with the family. I mean, we were with them for days, but for hours at a time each day. Kind of how this unfolded for those of you that aren't familiar with this case. We told you what happened in 1984. Basically, the case ends up suspended. They don't have a suspect at the time, and case goes cold, suspended. In 1999, they reopen the case, so to speak, take another look at it. They team up, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit and the Naval Criminal Investigative Services, NCIS, team up because the father was in the Navy.
Right.
And they start taking DNA. 1984, the way crime scenes were processed, the way investigators investigated was very different than the way it is now. The technology was very different. In that archived clip, you saw detectives standing around, people with cameras standing around. The scene wasn't really secure, or as secure as it would be now. We ended up cutting off the end of that footage because they actually, even back in 1984, sometimes the media goes for sensation and showed them loading the body of Tammy Welch into the back of a hearse, and we just didn't feel like that was appropriate to show. But it kind of parallels with a lot of what we deal with today with families and media, and sometimes some overzealous reporters. trying to make a name for themselves, really at the expense of the families and the victims. But anyway, back to 1999, they realized that, maybe we can take some cheek swabs from the neighbors that were there. DNA is now something that's used in criminal investigations at that time, but it's still pretty early on. So it doesn't really yield anything in 99. It's, looked at, and we found this out from talking with the family during the trial. All of this was going on. They weren't in any contact. No one was in contact with the family. I know that Mr. Welch told me that his wife would reach out every year on the anniversary to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and ask if there was any update. And because they were a military family, she would provide their up-to-date contact information, which is something that everybody should remember. If you move, change a phone number, and you have a loved one out there of an unsolved case, always be sure you call up and update that contact information with law enforcement agencies. So if something happens, they can find you and reach out to you. So from 1999, it goes on to 2012, and in 2012, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office gets a grant from the Department of Justice, and they start retesting some of those DNA samples from this case, and they get a partial profile from the sexual assault kit, from Tammy's assault kit. So they request all of the neighbors and witnesses and suspects, all their DNA for comparison and elimination purposes. In 2012, late 2012, early 2013, they get a match to a James Jackson, who was a neighbor of Tammy Welch. And they interview him. He claims to have never seen her. They show him a picture. He's never seen the girl. They were neighbors. His daughter and Tammy and Jennifer were friends. They played together, but he claims to have never seen her. Doesn't know anything about the assault and murder. And February 2013, he's arrested and charged in Tammy Welch's case. So that's 28 plus years, almost 29 years since the arrest. Jennifer told us, they had all but given up hope. They just really didn't think that anyone cared anymore, that anybody was looking, that they were ever going to find out who had done that to Tammy. That wasn't true. People were looking. People were investigating. Luckily, they told the story of how a member of NCIS called the family and said, I need to meet with you. And the family said, okay, well, when? And he said, well, soon. And I said, well, how soon? He said, well, I'm in your driveway right now, but I can't meet with you yet. I've got some phone calls to take care of. But I'm in your driveway and I need to meet with y'all in a little while. And apparently he sat out in the driveway for 45 minutes in constant contact with the sheriff's office that was interviewing the defendant, James Jackson, and ultimately ended up arresting him. And as soon as NCIS knew that arrest was happening,
then they let the family
know. They let the family know. And he was sitting there, NCIS was sitting there in the driveway ready to let them know. We've got a clip of the press conference that the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office did here. Again, this is in February of 2013, and we're going to play just a few clips of that so you can understand a little bit more of the case and who was involved.
I'd like to announce an arrest in this heinous murder case that has been gone unsolved for the past 28 years. The murder of young Tammy Welch outrages the citizens of Jacksonville, not only because of the age of the victim, but in the violent way she was killed and the brazen way her body was dumped. Tammy Welch was the child of a U.S. Navy father who was out to sea at the time, and on the day of the murder, Tammy Welch stayed home from school with her mother, her 12-year-old brother, and her 8-year-old sister. That morning, the family was actually moving from the apartment complex on 103rd Street to on-base housing. An autopsy conducted on Tammy Welch showed that she had been the victim of a brutal sexual assault. Tammy Welch's death was also determined to be the result of asphyxia and strangulation, and her death was ruled a homicide. Detectives worked the case diligently in 1984, but the case was eventually went cold, investigative activities were suspended, and the case classified as unsolved.
All right, so that was former Sheriff John Rutherford announcing an arrest in the Tammy Welch case and giving a little background on the family, including that Mr. Welch was in the Navy,
Right.
that he was out to sea. And I had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Welch during trial week. We find ourselves sitting out in the hallway, going to lunch together, waiting for witnesses, waiting for the judge, waiting for the trial to start back up. So you have plenty of time to get to know each other a little bit and kind of bond with these families. And I was asking Mr. Welch about his naval career, and they were from Maine. But they were stationed down here. He was out to sea. He told me that they told him on the ship that his daughter had been murdered, and that he's in the middle of the ocean. He's in the Navy. He doesn't dictate what he gets to do or when he gets to do it. He's told what to do and when to do. But he said that the commander at Cecil Field, which is where he was stationed at the time, called whoever was commanding the ship and said, this is what just happened to Tammy Welch. Her dad is on your ship, and I want him back in Jacksonville at absolute earliest possible time. And the commander of the ship said, well, there's not much I can do. We don't have, all we have is jets on here. He's not qualified to be on a jet. Commander Cecil Field said, get him on one of those jets. So he told me he had to go through like a training, video and don't stretch, don't touch anything, don't, if you scratch your back, you're going to hit the eject button. It was this really incredible story about the lengths that the military had gone to make sure that he could get home as quick as possible. And he said he's in this jet, they're flying to Puerto Rico, and they're about halfway there, and some alarm starts going off in the jet, and they said, they called back to the ship and said, this alarm's going off. And I said, well, you're about halfway. You can turn around and come back, or you can head to Puerto Rico. And he said the pilot just said, we're not turning around now. We're getting this man home. But then he said, the pilot said, but once I get him to Puerto Rico, how are you getting him back to Florida? And they said, well, we have a cargo plane in Puerto Rico that's going to be taking off in about 20 minutes or whatever. And the pilot said, I'm an hour and a half out, so you better make sure that cargo plane waits for us. And they did. They held the cargo plane. They land in Puerto Rico. Mr. Welch boards the cargo plane. That cargo plane is not bound for Florida. It's going to Norfolk, Virginia. They fly him to Norfolk. He says as soon as he exits the cargo plane, there's a driver with a commercial airline ticket back to Jacksonville, says hop in, gets him to the airport in Virginia and gets him home as absolutely quick as possible. And Mr. Welch told me, he said, the way the military treated me that day was my deciding factor in retiring from the Navy after 20 years and making it a career. He just was very grateful for how they allowed him to come home for that time, because he said he had been on the ship with other people that had lost somebody, probably not the same way, but that had lost family members, and they would have to wait sometimes days or a week before they could get to a port where they could get them off and get them home. And he was always felt indebted to his superiors in the Navy that took care of him and got him home. I thought that was just a really amazing story. Of course, he tells it so much better. He lived it, and it was great. But that, that's what that family had to go through, and then they waited and they waited and they waited, and then they finally found out who did it, and an arrest was made, and then kind of the process you talked about. When I've dealt with trials in the past, we used to tell people, don't ever expect a murder trial to happen within the first, year and a half after an arrest is made. Like, it was very, very rare that a defendant would waive speedy trial or wouldn't waive speedy trial and would want to have this trial very quickly. And usually the defense attorneys would encourage, to drag it out so that they could formulate an adequate defense. So a year and a half was kind of it's like, don't even start asking when you're going to have a trial for a year and a half. And typically somewhere between that year and a half and 2 years, the families would get to trial on average. But there was cases that would stretch out 3 years or stretch out, a couple of them 4 years. It was really, really rare for us back then to see cases go 5 years. I mean, they did occasionally, but Tammy's mom has some medical issues. Yes. Her health has been in decline since the arrest happened. She was not able to come to Jacksonville and see the trial, which I think was a burden on that, and an added burden on that family.
Of course.
It was, and then go ahead.
As a mother, she wanted to be there. And not to be able to be there, had to have been really hard for her.
And it's not just and it's not just she can't be there. Like, family has to turn their phone off when they go into the courtroom. There was no way for there to be constant communication back and forth. When trial would recess, Mr. Welch would go out and he'd call his wife, and he'd have to tell her, what was going on. The trial itself was very hard to sit through at some points.
It was.
It was very graphic. We're talking about a 10-year-old child,
little girl, that
was assaulted by a grown man, strangled, and basically dumped right outside the apartment where everything happened, and right next door to where she lived.
Because she wasn't hid. She was out in the open.
She wasn't. They never knew she was missing. We're talking about like a 30-minute window, right. So it wasn't a massive search for a missing child like we see sometimes. It was, you're there 1 minute. When we go back to get you, now your body is there, and in that short amount of time, somebody has done something horrific. As the trial kind of went on, again, it just felt different, and it took the jury 9 hours almost to deliberate, and
and you never know how long it's going to take them, and you have to stay close by.
This was on a Friday. Let's show some more pictures of Tammy while we're talking about this. So this is what we're talking about. You know what I mean? This is a human being. This is a life. This was a young girl that didn't get to experience so much that life has to offer, and her family was left holding the bag for years and years and years. And there was a lot of frustration, particularly with Mr. Welch. He had to kind of carry that burden as provider for his family, and almost felt like he didn't have time to grieve properly because he had to do everything he could to take care of the rest of the family.
He did.
And we had some serious conversations about that and the impact that had on him. That you know, he loved Tammy. He will read some of his some of the things he said in his impact statement, and it's heartbreaking.
It is. He loved his family dearly. His wife's health started going down. Mr. Welch is a good man, and he felt like it was his job to take care of his family. No matter what, he didn't discuss the death of his daughter to other people that he would meet.
He said that his wife would check in every year with the sheriff's office, but she wouldn't tell him that she checked in. He didn't know she was checking in until some point later on down the road. And he said, you know, well, I don't even know how they'd get in touch with us if they did. And she said, oh, well, I call every year and give them our updated contact information. It was really hard to listen to some of the things that poor Tammy had to go through. If you know, if you're joining us in the middle of this, we're talking about 10-year-old Tammy Welch, who was raped and murdered in Jacksonville, Florida in 1984. The man responsible was arrested in 2013, and the trial just concluded. The guilt phase of the trial concluded in November, and then the penalty phase concluded right before Christmas. And so Patty and I both sat in on both the guilt phase and the penalty phase, and we spent a lot of time with the family and wanted to use this opportunity to kind of talk about the judicial process in a cold case. The day in and day out of having the family didn't sleep pretty much the whole time they were here.
They didn't.
We would talk to them every morning. The next morning a trial, and they just said, you know, no sleep. You know, an hour here, hour there, restless sleep. Just wanting to get through to the next day.
It was just way too much for them to, handle.
So this was an interesting. I'll try to lay this out again, and I'm repeating some things in case we got some new people watching, but and we got a question coming in too, so I'm going to answer that in a second. But the family's burden when dealing with this is really supposed to be alleviated by advocacy and by advocates. Right. And we got a question that, where do advocates come in helping families through the situation? So let's put it this way. Start with, things have changed drastically from 1984. There probably weren't victim advocates working for the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office or the State Attorney's Office in 1984 in Florida. There may have been a few places that had people that helped out and that offered some services to the families, but they just didn't even have these options in 1984. Typically now, if somebody were to be the victim of a crime, because advocates aren't just exclusive to homicide, but that's what we handle, so we'll take it from there. If somebody were murdered today, the sheriff's office typically has an advocate, at least one. The state attorney's office has advocates. And so they're supposed to be with you basically from day one. We know that the reality is that's not really how it works. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office has a couple of advocates in a city of 1 million people. There's no way they could keep up with every single victim of every single crime that happens. They try to triage the situation, be a point of contact if necessary. In Jacksonville, we have had in the past a number of nonprofit organizations that stepped up and kind of became the advocates for the duration, and that would include before an arrest, when an arrest happened, and through the judicial process, and even after. The sheriff's office advocates have a specific scope that is pretty much information that deals with the sheriff's office. The state attorney's office has advocates. Their scope is pretty much to deal with victims and their families during the judicial process. When there's not an arrest, there's no reason for a state attorney's office advocate to reach out.
No.
And then after an arrest and conviction, there's no reason for a state attorney's office advocate or the sheriff's office advocate to reach out. So they're really just kind of left. Families a lot of times are left with nowhere else to go. Again, there are nonprofit agencies around the country that try to step in and facilitate, the services and needs for those victims and survivors in those other times, including us in between. We fit that niche where the sheriff's office doesn't have anything to say because the case has been suspended.
Right.
It's cold. There's no more information they can give. And the state attorney's office hasn't received it because no one's been arrested. So that left a gap of service for these families that were waiting for an arrest in the case, and that was where we came in. Now we're there publicizing their cases, trying to get the information out there in hopes of getting a resolution and an arrest, so that then we end up kind of tag teaming with the state attorney's office. We worked with them. They had advocates on staff during the trial as well.
Right.
That were there to help the family navigate that process. And now that the trial is over, we're still keeping in touch with the Welch family.
Yeah.
We talked to them, this week just to make sure that, of course, they were comfortable with us discussing some of the things we had, some of those conversations we'd had with them. They were gracious enough and said anything that could potentially help another family,
Right.
that they were open to. Unfortunately, we couldn't have them here because they live out of state. But we did get their permission, and they sent us the photographs. And really, when you spend all week with a family, you get to know them. You get to know their loved ones a little bit, and you kind of create a bond. But kind of so I hope that answered the question about advocates, where they come. You sometimes have to be very proactive in getting an advocate and making sure they understand your needs, especially with sheriff's offices and state attorney's offices, because they are stretched really, really thin. And typically in those types of situations, it's the family that's calling the most that gets the attention, and the family that's sitting back going, well, I don't want to bother them, I don't want to call them. They can sometimes kind of fall to the bottom of the stack. So reach out to your sheriff's office, your investigating agency, police department, whatever it is, state law enforcement. Ask them to make sure you have contact with an advocate, and if an arrest is made, then transition that right into the state attorney's office. And as always, reach out to us if we can help in any way. A lot of times our job is to just be a listening ear,
Right.
and you can call when you're having a bad day and venting, and we can kind of help you through that. I want to get a little bit back to the actual trial. As things work, the state presents a case, and the defense examines across the witnesses, and a picture starts to come together, and this sometimes can be frustrating, but it really is almost a chess match. The state is putting out information a little bit at a time that is not an entire picture. It starts to form, and they know that the defense is going to attack certain things, or they're going to try to discredit certain things. So they're trying to play a step ahead, 2 steps ahead, and it can be very interesting to watch. It's a talent to be a prosecutor. It can be very frustrating to watch if you're a family, because sometimes the game kind of takes over.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about law here, the judicial process, where there is not room for emotion. There can't be emotion. You can't prejudice the jury with emotion. So the families are under strict orders to sit and observe, and under no circumstances have an outburst. Under no circumstances to obviously stand up and start yelling at somebody or something that someone says, which can be very difficult.
I can't even imagine.
I remember the defense attorney in this case at one point during the penalty phase stood up, and the state was seeking death, and the defense attorney stood up and said, if you believe this prosecutor, then every person that rapes and murders a 10-year-old should get the death penalty. And the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. And I thought, oh my gosh, are there worse things than raping and murdering a 10-year-old? And I'm sitting here next to the victim's family thinking they just had to listen to that. It was at the very least offensive. And at the worst, it was, just a total re-victimization and treating that family and that victim like they didn't matter. I mean, to say that that's not the worst of the worst, and to
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it was stomach turning for me, and I wasn't a family member. But as those pieces start to come into focus, there was an interesting bit of evidence that was presented when James Jackson was arrested. He was also being investigated for some drug trafficking charges by the feds on a federal level, and so he actually was convicted of that drug charge and sent to a federal prison while this case was ongoing. And while he was in federal prison, he had Tammy Welch's name and the year she was murdered tattooed on his back.
By some inmates.
By some other inmates. This is an image of that tattoo, and so what we later found out was that he thought that when he got sentenced to in the federal case that they had dropped the Tammy Welch murder case, and so he had this tattooed on his back, thinking that he was safe from prosecution. He claims that for I can't remember what it was, 7 months or something that he was in the federal prison after getting this tattoo, that he never looked at it and never saw what it was, that it was a setup, that somehow these other inmates knew in another state, in a prison in another state, somehow knew what he had been charged with in Florida, and that they set him up. Now you remember, he happens to also be the neighbor whose DNA, partial profile DNA, is found in this little girl's sex kit, sexual assault test kit. So, you're talking about the most unlucky man in the world if he's innocent. He happened to be the victim's neighbor. His DNA happens to be on her, and then when he gets thrown in the federal pen, he just happens to fall in with these guys that know all of that and conspire against him to tattoo the victim's name on his back.
Yeah, it was a prank, he said.
Yeah, it was a prank, that they were, that it was a conspiracy. It was ridiculous to listen to, honestly. And so the second he comes back to the local jail to await trial on the murder and realizes that this charge is still there, and they take a picture of his new tattoo from federal prison, he immediately finds another inmate to tattoo over Tammy Welch's name and the year. If you could see, on the left said Tammy, on the right said Welch, and then in the middle of that was the year 1984. So then he had somebody tattoo over it, another inmate tattoo over it to hide it. But by then, the pictures had been taken and the damage done.
He thought he got away with it.
He thought he did. He thought that they had dropped the charges, and that I don't know if he thought it was double jeopardy, that they couldn't charge him again. I don't know what he thought, but he had the victim's name tattooed on his back. I don't.
That's very.
It was pretty sad, and that was one of the things that came out during trial. Of course, the family, knew that. but I think it was pretty shocking for those jurors, to see her name on his back. I felt like, through the trial started. I mean, they did jury selection on Monday. That went into Tuesday. And
Yes.
the trial started on Wednesday. I'm trying to remember
No,
if
it started Tuesday after jury selection was over.
Okay, and it went a couple of days, and then Friday was the closing arguments.
Yes.
And the jury started deliberating around noonish, and like you said earlier, hurry up and wait. You can walk far enough to get something to eat, but you better have your phone on you. And if something happens, you got to be back in that courtroom within a matter of minutes. If the jury reaches a verdict. So we stayed close. We grabbed some lunch and we sat right outside that courtroom door,
waiting.
And I've been in. One day I'll find all my records and I'll go through and count them all up, but easily over 50 trials and a number of death penalty trials, a handful of those, a dozen of those maybe, in my career as an advocate. And the jury can come back in 20 minutes. The jury can come back in 2 days, and it doesn't matter. You never know what it's going to be. They can come back guilty. They can come back not guilty in either of those time frames. And that is one of the hardest things for a family is, all right, well, if we don't have a verdict in an hour, what does that mean? If we don't have a verdict in 6 hours, what does that mean? And it's just impossible to know what is going on in that jury room and what the argument is over. This case was a first-degree murder charge. And you could find him guilty of first-degree murder because it was premeditated. And in the state of Florida, many people don't know this, but they don't actually fix a time frame with premeditation. Like we think of premeditation is, I'm going to write out a note that 2 weeks from today, I'm going to do something horrible to somebody, and I'm going to then go to the store and I'm going to buy a gun, and then I'm going to go buy some ammo, and then I'm going to go buy a ski mask 3 days later, and then I'm going to fill my car up with gas so that I can go on the run right after I do this. And they, usually you think, okay, they've laid out this complete timeline and this plan to hurt somebody, to murder somebody. That's premeditation. But the reality is the law says that all you need is a moment to realize what you're doing and reflect and realize that you can stop. So you're not going to stop a bullet, but this was strangulation, asphyxiation. She was strangled. Tammy was, and so the state argued that it took, and the medical examiner testified that it took time for Tammy to die, and that during that time frame, the defendant knew what he was doing, and he could have at any moment stopped, and she would have lived, but he didn't. So that was the charge for premeditation. If they didn't find that it was premeditated, he could still be guilty of first-degree murder because he was committing a sexual battery at the time he killed somebody. He raped and killed somebody, so that was felony murder. It would still be qualify as a first-degree murder charge, which carries with it a mandatory life sentence. So he was charged with first-degree murder, and he was charged with capital sexual battery with a victim under 12 years old, which carries a life sentence. Right. The state sought the death penalty, and when that happens, you go through the trial and you find out if he's guilty or not, and the jury has to unanimously decide guilty. If one person says he's not guilty, or two people, you get a hung jury, you can come back and retry it, but it has to be unanimous, either guilty or not guilty. Right. And that's the only way it can, basically the guilt phase be over. If they come back with a hung jury, they can't decide, you can come back and retry that case at a later date. So as the hours start piling on,
it was 9 hours.
It was 9 hours. On a Friday night, it was 8:30 or 9 o'clock by the time
it was 9-ish.
9-ish when the verdict came back in, and we had a very nervous family, and quite honestly, we were pretty nervous too because it seemed when you took the facts, I remember this came out too during the defendant took the stand himself, and when he got up there, the prosecutor asked him, well, when the police came to your door that day and told you that a little girl had been murdered, what was your response? And he said, my response was, what does that got to do with me? And the prosecutor said, don't you think that your response should have been, well, what can I do to help? And the defendant actually said, probably. That probably wasn't the right thing to say. But that was what he said, was, what does that got to do with me? The DNA evidence, which got complicated at times because it wasn't a full profile. It wasn't a complete match. It wasn't one of these where, you say, Patty, I know it's your DNA, on this cup, and I've compared it, and the odds are 1 in 900 quadrillion, 900 quadrillion to 1 that's you. It wasn't that way because it has degraded DNA from 1984. It took years. Again, they didn't even know DNA was a thing then. So it took years before they properly stored that, that evidence and were able to test it. And so the results were, it was degraded DNA, and they were only able to match it partially. Now, the state likened it to, they had a number and the defense had a number, and it was very complicated. I could understand the jury having some frustrations. The way I wish the jury, or I wish the prosecutor had described it, was there was like 7 markers, and they tested everybody that was in the apartment complex that day, all the neighbors and everybody that was around. And some of them matched at one place or two places, but the defendant was the only one that matched the 7 places that they were able to identify. And the defense was kind of trying to make it sound like, well, this person matched at 5, so why aren't they as good a suspect as this one that matched at 7? And I felt like the prosecutor should have said it was like a combination lock. If you have, 2 of the 3 numbers, it still doesn't work. You have to have all 3 numbers, and that's how you know. They had the DNA, and none of those other people, and I mean, it was like 17 or 18 other people that they had tested. None of those other matched at all the places, that he matched. And you have to, it wasn't a full profile, but he matched at every single one of those markers that were available. I think that complicated things for the jury, and I think they struggled with that. At the end of the day, 9 o'clock at night on a Friday night, we were all there. The family was still there. They had to check out of their hotel that day. And luckily, as the day dragged on and we realized it was going to take a while, the state was able to get them a hotel room for the night again. Not that they were going to sleep, but
we didn't want them on the road.
We didn't want them on the road at 10 o'clock at night. So the jury comes back with a verdict. We all stand in there. We're as nervous as can be, but they come back guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of sexual battery. It was the justice part, at least partial justice. They finally knew who did it, and he was convicted by a jury. It's hard to say it's a celebration because at the end of the day, Tammy's still dead. This guy got to live another, 28 plus years out free. And then, a few more years with, in jail, before he was convicted of this crime that he had done. His defense was all along that he was suffering from dementia, that he was not, that he had low IQ and had personality issues and mental disabilities. But it was impossible to go back and prove that he had those things 34 years earlier. So I don't know that stuff really weighed in on the jury. But go ahead.
I think the only what good came out of that was that justice was for Tammy. There was justice for her, and this person is not able to go out and hurt another person again.
Yeah.
He's in prison for the rest of his life. Nothing else changes for the Welch family.
No.
Nothing else changes. There is no closure. I don't believe in closure. I've said this before. They will still suffer and have a broken heart and miss Tammy every day. But there has been justice for her. But it doesn't change anything for the Welch family other than that.
And so then they had to come back a month later, 3
Yes.
weeks later, for the penalty phase. In a death penalty case, you have the guilt. He was found guilty. Now that he's guilty, now you have a penalty phase. And that is the opportunity for the prosecution and the state attorney's office to present they're listed statutes that are aggravating factors in a murder. I hope I'm explaining that right, but it's basically very specific things. It can only be an aggravator if it's listed in the Florida state statute. So one of those is if it's a heinous and atrocious crime, because he was convicted of first-degree murder and rape. It fell into those things. But there's only a few things that can escalate a murder to make it death penalty eligible. And then the defense gets to come in and basically say anything they want that can be a mitigating factor to the aggravators, which the jury can take into consideration, like you had a horrible childhood, you have these mental issues, basically are those excuses for what you got away, what you did. The state during the penalty phase called 2 witnesses, Jennifer, the sister, and Mr. Welch, the dad, and they read impact statements, and impact statements are an opportunity for the family to say how this loss has impacted their lives and their communities. And it's not really meant to be an opportunity to bash the defendant or talk about how horrible a human being they are. It really is an opportunity to talk about the victim, which sometimes gets lost in a criminal trial because the trial is about the defendant. And so it's a unique opportunity. And typically in a trial, a family will give these impact statements to the judge only during a sentencing hearing. But in a death penalty case, they actually get to read them to the jury. Now, the jury is instructed not to consider the emotion of those impact statements and making their decision. But the family provided us with copies of the impact statements. We just showed you one that was tweeted out by one of the local news stations, Action News, Jax. Jennifer's impact statement was 5 pages long, and I mean just heart-wrenching. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I highlighted some things that I thought were important for multiple reasons. One, for families that are going to find their day in court, some of the things that are important to talk about. The victim alive, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And then also for those that are out there listening, the reality of these, what this family has lived with for 34 years. This doesn't go away the day that the murder happens. It doesn't go away the day an arrest is made. It doesn't go away the day that there's a conviction. These feelings will be with this family forever. And Mr. Welch points that out in his, but just a couple of things that Jennifer said, and the way she described Tammy as a bright girl, smart, musically inclined, wide, brown-eyed, brown hair, saying hello to everyone. And I'll show some more pictures of her. Just an outgoing, energetic, typical 10-year-old girl. When that tragic day happened, I lost more than a sister. I felt like I lost a part of me that I was unsure I would ever regain. The thought of what if it was this person created trust issues. Because she was taken from me, I feared that I would have to die also. There were family, friends, and counselors who would talk to me often, but the fear never died. Jennifer carried some guilt with her because, as we mentioned earlier, they were playing and then they got into a little spat, and Jennifer stormed upstairs, and then Tammy was killed, and you know, that was, God, to have to live with that when that was not her fault. There was one person's fault, one person at fault, one person that did that to Tammy. You know, I just feel so bad, you know, that she has lived all this time tore up by that. Like she could have prevented it, or she could have stopped it, or if she had stayed. I mean, it's so hard. It wasn't her fault,
but she, of course, as a child.
As she says, the guilt, the feeling that all of this was my fault because I left Tammy alone. She says being a spoiled little sister. I mean, she told us that multiple times, that she, you know, Tammy didn't want to do what Jennifer wanted her to do, so she said, I'm going upstairs. Right. I mean, you see it on every playground at every school and every backyard of every sibling, you know, ever. You know, that is not why Tammy was killed.
No, of course not.
You know, but I understand why she feels that way, and that burden that she carries. You know, you wish there was a way you could lift that from them, but just saying it's not your fault doesn't do that. You know, she feels that, you know. She says, my father bought me a great big Maine Coon cat, which I named Playful. She was to be my new night companion, my new room buddy, but Playful could never replace Tammy. You know, this is growing up. She did, and this is growing up, you know, without her sister. And she goes on to talk about, you know, meeting boys and having crushes and not having that sister to talk to, and how Tammy would never meet boys and have crushes. She talks about meeting her, who she ended up marrying. And how Tammy couldn't be there at her wedding, you know, and
she named her daughter, Jennifer named her daughter after Tammy.
Oh yeah, her daughter. She named her daughter, and then her granddaughter looks just like Tammy. So she says, on September 17th, 2014, I became a grandmother. She is a wide-eyed, brown-haired, brown-eyed, fiery little girl, just like my sister. She will never physically have the right to know. Every time I look at her, I feel like I'm looking back between 1975 and 1984.
Very emotional.
It was hard to listen to these. The jury, most of them were in tears. I mean, you know, she goes on to say, on July 27th, 1984, as a child myself, my life changed forever. Nothing in my life would ever be the way it should have been or could have been because of the violent act of another. I can name so many things that Tammy missed, but they would never compare to what we missed with her. We will never met Tammy's children or her grandchildren. I will never be there for Tammy at her worst or her best. She kind of finishes with saying, all I'm left with and all I can do is give Tammy justice, a voice of what was the last day of her short life and the life that was taken from me. I'm left hoping that Tammy is smiling down on us. Again, the emotion, you know, when she was reading that, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. Then Mr. Welch, he got up and gave his impact statement too. And just a couple things that he said that I highlighted. Tammy was such a sweet, innocent, intelligent child. Tammy enjoyed art, reading, music, swimming, loved school, and with babies, she was like a little mother hen when around them. He said Tammy loved music. Tammy wanted to play the guitar and sing, so her grandmother got her an acoustic guitar for Christmas in 1983, not knowing 8 short months later the guitar would be silenced forever. I still have her guitar in the original box case. It has not been touched since.
That's amazing.
He said, I imagine Tammy's first dance, that oh so cute boyfriend, you know, the one, her first kiss, the prom, and then the first heartache, the breakup, driver's license, school sports, graduation, maybe college, work, or meeting the man who would be the one to share Tammy's future with. Then, Dad, will you walk me down the aisle? A father's dream that Tammy has found him, her soulmate, and will be happy forever. We had 35 years of empty chairs at Christmas, birthdays, holidays, family birthdays, graduations, weddings, births, and yes, even funerals of great-grandparents, grandparents, and even one day a parent after living our lives fully. Now all I can do is dream about who Tammy could, would, or even should have become in her life. No matter what anyone says, the loss and suffering truly never goes away. It just becomes tolerable. One of the Navy SEALs' motto is, "The only easy day was yesterday." To me, as a survivor of a cruel, vicious, unthinkable act, that motto is true. You are missed by your family. There is not a day that goes by that your daddy doesn't think about you. Tammy Jean, my sweet daughter. Again, just tears among the jury, tears among the people in the audience watching. The state attorney was there, Melissa Nelson.
Yes,
she was tearing
was showing
up.
tears too.
It was a very emotional moment, but Mr. Welch and Jennifer did amazing on the stand. They read these statements. There was obvious emotion, but
they did an awesome job. They really did.
They maintained their composure.
Yes, they handled themselves very well. Even as hard as it was, they really did. They handled themselves very well. I'm just so proud of them. They're just wonderful people who, have suffered a great loss.
Yeah. And at that point, the state rested and the defense was able to give had the defendant's family come in and talk about what a wonderful dad. I think he had 15 children, and a number of them came in talking about what a great dad he was. Some siblings of his came in and talked. Neuroscientist or neurologist or something talking about his brain and the damage that had been caused over the years from whatever, and so then the jury deliberates again, and they get the opportunity to decide whether James Jackson would be put to death or would serve a life in prison. Now, to kind of frame this, Mr. Jackson's 66 years old now. He is on oxygen. He was not going to survive death row. Like, he would never have survived to get to the needle, just with all the appeals and everything. He was going to die on death row or in general population. Was pretty well what everybody, the conclusion everybody reached. Nobody really thought that he was going to be executed.
Right.
But while the jury was deliberating, we had more time to sit and talk with the family. And Mr. Welch told me, he said, I know he's not going to get the death penalty. He said, I feel like he's not going to get it. I know he's not going to get it, but that's what I want.
That's what he wanted.
I want, and through talking, it was clear. He wanted validation that Tammy's life was important and mattered. Because as we mentioned earlier, if this case had been 2 years ago, the publicity and the outcry and the public support and it would have been different. And I just can't help but think that it taking 34 years to get this case, let me just finish. The jury came back and they voted life. Which again was pretty much expected. It didn't feel like a death penalty case, but Mr. Welch had said, if they come back life, I'm walking out of that courtroom. And I think the biggest shocker was, while you have to be unanimous for guilt, with the death penalty now in Florida, you also have to be unanimous. So I was going to take all 12 jurors voting for death for him to get it.
Right.
And if it was just one juror that said, I'm sticking to my conviction, I don't believe in the death penalty, if it was 11-1, then that was still going to be life in prison.
Right.
And I think after listening to the state's closing arguments, which were some of the most powerful closing arguments I've ever heard in my life, at one point, I'm not going to repeat it because it was very graphic, but the prosecutor said something that literally sucked the air out of the courtroom. It was so quiet. It was like a vacuum, and people were scared to breathe because they didn't want to be what broke that silence. Yeah. And I started listening after that, and I started, like, you can always hear something. There's somebody moving, shuffling papers, clearing a throat, coughing, sneezing, talking. I mean, there is all the air conditioner vent blowing. There is always a noise that you can hear in that courtroom, except at that moment. And it was such a powerful statement, and it was completely, just a horrifying and graphic statement. Yeah. But it just made everybody stop. And I wouldn't even move my head, but I was shifting my eyes around the room to see if anybody else was moving, and no one was moving, no one was talking, no one was breathing, and it just hung in the air for a moment. And then after that was when the defense attorney came out and said, if you listen to this prosecutor, then everybody that rapes and murders a 10-year-old should get the death penalty. And then, followed that up by saying the death penalty should be reserved for the worst of the worst, as if raping and murdering a 10-year-old is not the definition of the worst of the worst. But when those closing arguments were done and the jury was deliberating, I actually started to think they might get the death penalty. I actually started to think that closing argument was so good, and then the defense was so callous and just disregarding the value of a 10-year-old girl's life. I mean, at one point, I know that, the dad told me, he said, I cannot believe a woman would get up and say those things, and discount the life of a little girl. And I said, well, I don't know her. I said, she's obviously a woman, but she may not be a mother. And I don't know if she is or not, but it was definitely hard to believe that someone that had all nurtured and cared for their own young could be so dismissive of a 10-year-old girl's life. And so I left there and I thought, wow, for weeks I've been saying, for some reason this doesn't feel like a death penalty case, and I was attributing it to it taking so long to get the arrest and conviction. Yes. But I was feeling pretty good, and Dad, Mr. Welch, kept telling me, I know I'm not going to get it, but that's what I want, and if they come back life, I'm walking out of the courtroom. So I said, all right, when you walk out, I'm going to walk out with you. And I said, I'm not going to bother. He says, well, I'll be honest, I just need a few minutes to sulk because I know I'm not going to get my way. He was saying all this before, the jury came back. Right. And I said, well, I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Welch. I'm not going to bother you, but I'm going to follow you out because there's going to be people in that courtroom that want to know where you are and what you're doing, and I'll be able to tell them that I got eyes on you, that this is where we are, that you just needed a minute, whatever. And so we agreed. If it came back life, he was going to get up and walk out, and I was going to follow him, and he was going to take a few minutes to digest what had just happened. Well, the jury did come back life. And I think probably the hardest part was that there actually was only one juror that voted death. So it was 11-1 life, or 1-11 death, and so he stormed out, and I followed him, and we were keeping in contact via text message. We left the courthouse, and then came back in because it was getting late that day, and we sat down in the cafe and we were talking, and then some of the detectives came in, and investigators, came in, and then they were trying to convince him that he was in the wrong for leaving and he should go back up there, and he was trying to convince them that, that he, this is how he felt. Yeah. And he was well within his rights to feel that way. And what I guess wasn't really verbalized at that moment was that Mr. Welch wanted validation of his daughter's life, deserved validation of his daughter's life, and that jury decided to show the defendant the mercy that the defendant didn't show his daughter.
Exactly.
And that was really the crux of it, is that he didn't believe that the defendant was going to be executed. He wanted 12 independent jurors to tell that defendant that you don't get to rape and murder 10-year-old girls that your life is not more valuable than hers. And he felt like, with their verdict, that they were saying that his life was more valuable than Tammy's, that the defendant's life was more valuable than Tammy's. And the jury had that right to reach a verdict of life. I'm not even saying it was the wrong verdict, because as we talked about, everybody suspects that this guy will die in prison long before he would have ever been executed. But that's really what it came down to, was some validation from a jury, and he didn't feel like he received that. And so then some people came down, and the judge was going to sentence him right then to life.
Right.
And they convinced Mr. Welch that he should go up, and Mr. Welch didn't want to go back up. And they kind of told him, I don't want you to regret this a year from now, that you weren't in there when the judge sentenced him to life. And
he did come up, right?
And he did come up, and then he walked out again because he was really upset that he had come back up there for that. It was hard. It was very hard, and they got justice. The man that murdered Tammy has been identified and will spend the rest of his life in jail. He actually received 2 life sentences consecutive. So if there were an appeal on one, that something got muddled up and overturned, he would still have another life sentence behind that one. They weren't running concurrently, they were running consecutively. And at the end of the day, for 28 years they didn't know that they would ever even have that day in court. So I think that he was caught up in the emotion a little bit.
Of course.
He was very, very honest with me that if he doesn't get what he wants, he sulks. I mean, those are his words, and so I actually have a tremendous amount of respect for Mr. Welch and what he has gone through and what he has dealt with, and the fact that he walked out of a courtroom after some people, voted life, that doesn't diminish my respect for him in the least. I think it made a statement, and quite honestly, I think it was the right statement.
Yeah, I did too.
It was hard to believe that only one person on that jury felt like that defendant deserved the death penalty. It really, really was. And I say that knowing that he wasn't going to get the death penalty. He was never going to be executed. Our inmates are on death row for 15, 20 years, and
right.
It'll have tons of appeals.
He definitely wouldn't have made it that
but,
long.
But I thought for sure we were going to see a greater number of people at least make the statement that he deserved death for taking the life of a 10-year-old girl. And I was surprised by it. I really was.
But the whole time the jury, they were, they surprised me with different things from, with the trial and then the death penalty. And it took, 4 or 5 hours for them to come back. So
it was another long.
It was a long time. So, and
Thursday night we had a support meeting. You had to leave town for a funeral as soon as that was over. We all expected it to be you had to fill out a lot of paperwork, but you take a vote. Who believes in death, who doesn't? Well, that's our vote. It was not that way. It was hours, which is, it means the jury discussed a lot.
That's good.
Which is good. That's what you want. But I still don't understand how only one person.
I don't either. Why it took that long for just one person.
But they did their civic duty. They found him guilty, which was the important thing. He won't be able to do that to any more 10-year-old girls or anybody else. And it's a shame that he was able to live a free man for 28 years before they ever identified him. But that being said, there's a lot of us watching and sitting here that, are sitting at a lot less time than 28 years in our loved ones' cases, and that provides hope. You know what I mean? That provides us with an opportunity to realize that as those years start to stack up,
there's always hope.
There's always hope. And so we're, that's what we're here for. And again, to Tammy's family, Mr. Welch and Jennifer, thank you for allowing us to be there and support you. Thank you for allowing us to talk about this case and share with other families some of the experiences and hopefully, some of the expectations that it's not always a smooth and fast journey from arrest to conviction, and there are still hurdles and there's still that emotional roller coaster connected. But we got to know you guys really, really well, and think you're an amazing family. We wish we could see you more.
I know.
I think Mr. Welch, when he walked out of that courtroom, he said, if it were up to me, we'd leave right now. It was getting late at night. It was already dark. It was like 6 o'clock at night.
Right.
And he said, if it was up to me, we'd jump in the car and drive 10 hours or
it's about 10
hours
drive.
back home. He said, I want to get out of this state, which made me feel horrible. You know what I mean? I love the state we live in. There's a lot of good to it, but it left him with a bad taste, at least at that time. And I don't expect that we'll see them driving through anytime soon. But on another note, he lives in Isle of Wight, where your daughter was murdered or found, and
imagine that.
And in a small world. And fingers crossed, if that case ever gets solved, maybe we'll come up and hang out with the Welches again for that trial.
If I ever go back to Virginia for Carrie's case,
yeah,
I will definitely be looking them up. And Jennifer and Mr. Welch, we love you both, and thank you for allowing us to get to know you and allowing us to do this today. If it just helps one person, it would be wonderful. But we're hoping it will help a lot of people. And just thank you so much. We're very lucky to know you both.
Yeah, well said, Patty. Well said. That's pretty much it for our Tammy Welch case today. Just kind of in closing, want to share our event coming up on the 26th. This is our fourth annual Year of Hope event. It's a fundraiser for Project Cold Case. It's held here in Jacksonville, Florida. There's all the information on your screen. It's on our Facebook page. It's on our website, projectcoldcase.org/events. We'll be talking more about it. We'll probably talk a little bit about it next week, and then the following week we're going to do a whole Facebook Live on the 22nd showing all the auction items that we have and acknowledging our sponsors and those donors and contributors. A couple of things that we've gotten recently that are really cool. I don't know how well you can see that. Hard Knots Design provided they're coasters. It's 4 coasters. They're slices of a tree, and they're wood burned logo of Project Cold Case on each of the coasters, which is really cool. They also did the sign that you see behind us that's always on display during these Facebook Lives, and they also at one point this year donated 10% of the proceeds of the month of November to Project Cold Case, which is something they do every month. They pick a new charity,
right,
and they donate proceeds from that month's sales to that charity. I mean, it's just really cool. Colton is the owner of Hard Knot Designs, and he's friends with our producer and marketing guy, Clint, here in the office, and Clint turned us on to him, and Colton's been just really great to us, and we wish him just continued success, and know he's going to do great things because he makes great work.
Yeah, his work is very good.
So this is another thing. This is pretty interesting. If you don't recognize the book, it's I'll Be Gone in the Dark. It was written by Michelle McNamara before she passed away. She was a true crime blogger and writer and kind of guru, and she was doing a lot of work on the Golden State Killer case and trying to identify who he was. Unfortunately, she passed away before he was arrested, but her husband was comedian Pat Oswald, and we had some connections with him after his wife died, and he reached out to us, and we were looking to do some work together. So we asked him if he would send us a signed copy of his wife's book, and so if you can see there, he wrote the afterword in the book, and then he autographed that for us and donated a copy to be auctioned off at our event. So those are just a couple of the things that we'll have up for auction.
We've got some great things.
We got some great things.
I will say this. Our events are always a lot of fun.
They are a lot of fun. You think murder is always
Exactly.
a downer and a bad thing, but we're about hope and providing smiles and allowing families to get back to that place where they can enjoy life and smile again and not feel guilty about it. And our event will have a silent live auction. There will be food provided and a cash bar. Again, the information is up there. We'll talk about it again a little bit next week. And then the following week on the 22nd, look for our Facebook Live to have lots of cool auction items and recognition for those that are helping us raise money and do great things. I think that's it. We went a long one today. There was a lot of information on Tammy's case. So we hope that you can get through it and watch it and that it helps you in some way. And we will see you next week. Next Tuesday for another Facebook Live. Thanks for tuning in. Check us out on projectcoldcase.org.
Great.
Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
And I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now. A triple shooting leaves 2 dead and a...
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
All I wanted was the family to be able to know that someone else cared. If you send me a case, I will put your loved one's picture on my website. What started as send us your pictures has turned into spotlights and billboards and meetings with family members and support groups, meeting with law enforcement.
We've had examples recently where technology has improved and where forensic evidence didn't provide us anything 10, 20, 30 years ago. Today it can.
We've been lucky enough now to have 7 cases on our website. 4 of them arrests have been made and 3 of them have had convictions. That's the moment I do everything for, is the moment to sit there with a family when they get word that an arrest has been made.
I think Project Cold Case is going to be the national model.
If a family submits their loved one's case to us, we will always consider them for every opportunity that ever comes across our desk. And that's something that I don't think there's another organization out there that could possibly do.